A flight attendant refused a glass of water to a quiet man in first class. She had no idea who he really was, or what would happen when the plane landed. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The airport was buzzing with activity, the kind of hum that never really stopped. Rolling suitcases, loudspeaker announcements, the shuffle of impatient footsteps. In the middle of all this movement, a family of 4 moved calmly through the crowd. Jonathan, the father, wore a fitted black suit, not a wrinkle in sight. His face stayed calm, serious, giving away nothing. Beside him walked his wife, Amina, dressed in a soft beige coat and carrying a dark brown leather handbag. She held the hand of their daughter, Layla, while their son, Amir, walked just behind, pulling a small silver suitcase. There was nothing flashy about them. No logos, no loud voices, no rushing. But people still moved out of their way. There was something about the way Jonathan walked, about how Amina carried herself, like they weren't used to waiting in lines or being questioned, like they belonged everywhere they went. They reached the first-class gate. The airline worker glanced at their tickets without much interest. "Enjoy your flight," he mumbled, scanning each one. Jonathan gave a polite nod. Amina offered a quiet smile, and the children followed their parents through the gate without a word. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin was already half full. The air smelled like new leather, warm lighting reflected off polished surfaces, and soft music played in the background. Jonathan took the window seat, Amina beside him, and across the aisle, Layla and Amir settled into their own seats. They didn't talk much, just soft glances between each other, a nod here and there. The family didn't act impressed or out of place. They had done this many times before. Rebecca, the senior flight attendant, moved through the aisle with fast, trained steps. Her navy blue uniform was crisp, her blonde hair tied back perfectly, and her face held a fixed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She glanced at each passenger, checking seatbelts, offering forced greetings. When she looked at Jonathan's family, her smile froze for a moment. Her eyes swept over their quiet, well-dressed appearance, then narrowed just slightly. She didn't say anything, just gave a brief nod and kept walking. It didn't take long before someone behind Jonathan's row asked for water, a middle-aged man in a suit, clearly a regular flyer. Rebecca smiled at him warmly. "Of course, sir. Sparkling or still?" She returned a minute later with a bottle, glass, and a cloth napkin. Moments later, Layla looked across the aisle toward Rebecca, who had just passed them. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Can I please have a bottle of water?" Rebecca didn't even pause. "We'll serve drinks after takeoff, sweetie," she said, her tone flat. She walked away without looking back. Layla glanced at her mother. Amina gently placed her hand on Layla's arm and gave a soft smile, saying nothing. Amir shifted slightly in his seat, watching Rebecca move up the aisle without a second glance at them. A few minutes passed. Amina pressed the call button. Rebecca returned, her smile tighter now. "Yes?" Amina spoke with the same calm tone she had used at the gate. "It's a bit warm in here. May I please have a small bottle of water for my children?" Rebecca leaned closer, lowering her voice but not her sharpness. "As I mentioned, we'll be serving drinks after takeoff. I'll have to ask for your patience." There was no kindness in her voice, just control. Not quite rude, but far from respectful. Amina gave a small nod and looked away. Rebecca turned and walked off, not noticing the look Jonathan gave his wife, or the way his hand moved slowly to his phone. He typed something quickly and placed it face down on the armrest. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The last passengers boarded. The doors shut. The plane began to push back from the gate. Everyone settled in. The seatbelt sign turned on. The safety video started. But something had already shifted. And what Rebecca didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that the biggest mistake of her entire career had just been made. The engines roared gently as the plane began taxiing toward the runway. Rebecca moved through the cabin, checking tray tables and belts, wearing that same professional mask she had worn for years. But her mind drifted back to the family. Something about them bothered her. They hadn't been loud, they hadn't caused trouble, but there was a quiet confidence in them she didn't like. Especially the mother, too calm, too composed. And the father hadn't said a single word since boarding, just sat there with that unreadable look, as if he already knew how this flight would go. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder as she passed their row again. The mother, Amina, was helping Layla adjust her seatbelt. Amir was staring out the window. Nothing unusual. Still, Rebecca felt herself getting annoyed. Maybe it was the way they hadn't seemed surprised to be in first class. Maybe it was the quiet way they had asked for water, like they expected things to be given without question. Rebecca had seen it before. People who thought money meant manners didn't matter. The wheels lifted from the ground and the aircraft climbed smoothly into the sky. A soft chime rang through the cabin as the seatbelt sign turned off. Rebecca stood near the galley, pouring water into glasses for the front row. Another attendant, Chloe, stepped beside her, sorting snacks. "Do you want me to do the second row?" Chloe offered. Rebecca shook her head. "No, I've got it." She returned to the aisle, carefully balancing a tray with glasses. The man in seat 2A smiled as she handed him his drink. She gave him her best customer service smile, then moved to the next seat. But when she reached Amir and Layla, she paused. She looked down at them for a second too long, then skipped their row entirely. Layla blinked. "Excuse me," she said again, a little more softly this time. "May I have some water now?" Rebecca didn't stop walking. "I'll come back to you," she said curtly, her eyes already on the next passenger. But she didn't come back. Jonathan watched all of it quietly. His expression didn't change, but his phone buzzed once on the armrest. He glanced at it, nodded slightly, and turned the screen over again. Chloe noticed the exchange from the galley. She leaned toward Rebecca, her voice low. "Hey, did you skip the kids on purpose?" Rebecca frowned. "They're not kids, and I didn't skip anyone. They can wait." Chloe didn't say anything, but she gave Rebecca a look, uncertain, almost uncomfortable. Back at the family seats, Amina leaned over to Jonathan. "That's the third time," she whispered. "They're watching." Jonathan didn't respond. He picked up his phone again and typed a short message. Then he put it away. Up in the cockpit, the captain's radio buzzed to life. The co-pilot leaned over, reading the incoming message. His brows lifted slightly. "Sir," he said, glancing at the captain, "we just got a direct alert from King Aviation Holdings." The captain straightened. "What kind of alert?" The co-pilot looked at him carefully. "Founder is on board, seated in 1A, special protocol flagged, immediate attention required." The captain went still for a moment. Then he reached for the intercom button. Back in first class, Rebecca continued pouring drinks, unaware that the quiet man she had ignored was no ordinary passenger, and that her choices had already started working against her. The captain stepped out of the cockpit without a word, smoothing down his uniform jacket as he walked calmly but directly into the first-class cabin. The sudden appearance of the pilot caught the attention of several passengers. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Even Rebecca hesitated when she saw him heading in her direction. He didn't speak right away. He scanned the rows until his eyes landed on Jonathan, the man in the first seat, the man who hadn't raised his voice once. The captain approached slowly, respectfully. "Sir," he said in a steady tone, "is everything all right?" Jonathan looked up, his voice quiet but clear. "Not yet," he replied, "but it will be." The captain gave a small nod and stepped back. That was all the confirmation he needed. He returned to the cockpit. Rebecca stood frozen. She had never seen the captain walk into the cabin for a passenger unless something serious had happened. She turned toward the galley, her chest tightening. Chloe watched her with a confused expression. "What's going on?" Chloe asked. Rebecca forced a shrug. "I don't know." But she did know. She just didn't want to admit it. Something was off. The way the captain looked at that man, the way he spoke to him, like he already knew who he was. Rebecca tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just a high-level executive. Maybe it was a coincidence. She turned back to the drink cart, but her hands were shaking now. She couldn't explain why, but something about Jonathan's silence scared her more than any angry passenger ever had. Meanwhile, Jonathan remained seated, calm as ever. Amina leaned in. "It's done?" He nodded. "Yes." Layla glanced at them. "What did you do?" Jonathan looked at his daughter and said, "Sometimes, when people don't see you, you remind them who you are." The rest of the cabin didn't know what was unfolding, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavier, like the moment before a storm. Some passengers noticed Rebecca's nervous movements, the way she kept glancing at the front of the plane. Rebecca picked up the intercom phone, dialing into the cockpit. "Captain, is there something going on I should be aware of?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then the captain's voice returned, cold and firm. "Yes, Miss Fields. You'll be informed shortly." Click. She stood there, hand still on the receiver, as a cold feeling spread through her chest. Something was wrong, very wrong. And the worst part was, whatever it was, had already begun. Rebecca tried to steady her breathing as she returned the intercom phone to its place. Her palms were damp now, and her usual confidence had started to slip. She turned back toward the aisle and caught Chloe watching her again. "You all right?" Chloe asked under her breath. Rebecca forced a tight smile. "Yeah, just tired." But she wasn't tired. She was rattled. She couldn't stop thinking about the look the captain gave that man. The same man she had brushed off earlier, more than once. And now he had the captain stepping out mid-flight and answering to him like some sort of top official. Rebecca didn't like being left out of the loop, especially not when it involved her cabin. She walked down the aisle again, pretending to check on passengers. But really, she was watching Jonathan's row. The whole family looked calm. Not smug, not angry, just steady. That only made it worse. As she passed by, Amir glanced up at her, then looked away. No words, no attitude. But that silence was louder than anything he could have said. She returned to the galley, where Chloe was now organizing snack trays. "I think he's someone important," Chloe said suddenly. Rebecca turned. "Who?" "The man in 1A. The father." Rebecca rolled her eyes. "A lot of people think they're important in first class." "No," Chloe said, shaking her head. "This is different. The captain's acting strange. He never speaks like that. And did you see how calm that man was? He knew exactly what he was doing." Rebecca didn't answer. Deep down, she already knew Chloe was right. Suddenly, the cockpit door opened again. This time, it was the co-pilot who stepped out. He walked straight to the galley and handed Rebecca a folded piece of paper. His expression was unreadable. "What's this?" she asked, unfolding it quickly. The paper was short, just a few lines. "Miss Fields is to be removed from active service for the remainder of this flight, effective immediately. You are to take the rear jump seat and have no contact with passengers. Operations control, per instruction of KAH Executive Office." Rebecca's heart dropped. "What is this? Who sent this?" The co-pilot didn't blink. "It came directly from the executive office, that's all I can tell you." Rebecca looked at him, her voice rising slightly. "You're grounding me mid-flight? For what?" He didn't respond. He just nodded once and turned to leave. Chloe stood frozen, her eyes wide. "Rebecca." But Rebecca couldn't hear her. Her ears were ringing. She stared down at the paper, reading it over and over. This had to be a mistake. She had followed protocol. She had done her job, hadn't she? But the message was clear. She wasn't the one in charge anymore. And whoever this family was, they weren't just passengers. They were the reason her world was about to collapse. Rebecca stood in the narrow galley, frozen, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. Her stomach felt hollow. Her chest tightened. This couldn't be real. In all her years with the airline, she had never been removed mid-flight, not even close. She had trained junior staff, led difficult flights, handled emergencies. She was respected. People followed her lead. And now, she was being quietly pushed out. No warning, No explanation beyond a printed note. She turned toward Chloe, her voice low and harsh. "This has to be a mistake." Chloe didn't look convinced. "Rebecca, that order came from corporate." Rebecca stepped forward, whispering quickly. "For what? For not bringing water right away?" "I didn't scream at anyone. I didn't insult anyone. I followed standard procedure." "You didn't treat them the same as the others," Chloe replied, careful with her words. "You know that." "They were the only ones who asked before takeoff," Rebecca snapped. "You think this is about water?" Chloe hesitated, then looked away. Rebecca clenched her jaw. It's something else. They must know someone. They must be." Her voice stopped mid-sentence as realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She turned her head slowly and looked toward 1A. Jonathan sat still, relaxed, one hand resting on the armrest, the other gently tapping on his phone. Amina was reading something on a tablet. The children were watching a movie quietly, headphones in. Not one of them had raised their voice. Not once had they made a scene. And yet, somehow, their silence had caused more disruption than any shouting passenger ever could. Rebecca felt the air turn heavier. She walked slowly back to the front of the cabin. Passengers were beginning to notice the tension now. How she had suddenly disappeared from the aisle. How she wasn't serving drinks anymore. A few gave her curious glances. One man near the front whispered something to his wife and nodded toward Jonathan's row. When Rebecca reached the last row of first class, she paused beside Jonathan. She lowered her voice, trying to sound composed. "Sir, I believe there's been some confusion. If I said anything that came across as—" Jonathan looked up at her. Just one glance. Calm, quiet, completely unreadable. "No confusion," he said. Rebecca swallowed. "I wasn't aware of any special protocol regarding your family. If I had been notified earlier." He held up a hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop her words. "You assumed you didn't need to be," he said softly. The sentence hit her like a slap, even though his tone never changed. Amina didn't look up. She kept reading. Rebecca's hands tightened into fists at her sides. "I didn't mean any harm," she said quickly. "I treat all passengers—" "No," he interrupted again. "You treat passengers the way you think they deserve to be treated." He didn't say it loudly, but the words echoed anyway. Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but she couldn't find anything to say. Her throat was dry. Her thoughts were racing too fast. Jonathan returned his attention to his phone. "You've been relieved of duty," he said calmly. "You should take your seat now." Rebecca's heart pounded. She looked around. Chloe stood further back, watching carefully. The other passengers nearby had gone quiet, pretending not to listen, but absolutely listening. And so, for the first time in her career, Rebecca Fields did what she had never done before on a flight. She walked slowly past the passengers she once gave orders to, past the people she used to correct and control, and headed toward the back of the plane. Not as the one in charge, but as the one who had just been removed. The aisle felt longer than usual. Each step echoed with the sound of her authority slipping away. Rebecca's shoes tapped softly against the cabin floor as she made her way down the aisle, her shoulders stiff and face blank, but inside, everything was falling apart. She passed row after row of silent passengers. Some glanced at her discreetly. Others didn't bother to hide their stares. Every step felt heavier than the last, like her uniform was weighing her down, pressing into her skin like it no longer belonged to her. And maybe it didn't. She reached the back of the plane where the crew jump seat was folded up near the galley. A junior flight attendant named Farah was there, restocking cups and organizing snack trays. She looked up and froze when she saw Rebecca. It was rare for a senior to be back here mid-flight unless something serious had happened. "Everything okay?" Farah asked, her voice hesitant. Rebecca gave a tight nod. "Just taking a break." But it wasn't a break. She pulled down the jump seat and sat with her hands in her lap, trying to stay composed, even as her thoughts spiraled. Her mind flashed through everything again and again. Layla's quiet voice asking for water, Amina's calm eyes, Jonathan's silence. She kept thinking, I didn't yell, I didn't insult anyone, I didn't even refuse them water outright. But deep down she knew it wasn't about what she had said. It was about how she said it. The dismissiveness, the assumptions, the way she treated them like they didn't belong. She wanted to believe it was just protocol. But that lie no longer comforted her. Behind her, the hum of the engines filled the space. She stared at the floor. She didn't belong back here. This was where new hires sat, where trainees sat. Not her, not someone with years of service. But here she was, removed without warning, without a chance to explain herself. Her hands curled tightly in her lap. They're punishing me for a misunderstanding, she thought bitterly. This isn't fair. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, opening her crew app. Maybe there was a message, a clarification, something to explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No alert, no message from the flight lead, no instructions from HR. Only silence. Then, as if on cue, her screen lit up with an incoming email. She opened it quickly. It was from the airline's internal operations desk. Just one line stood out. Subject, immediate action logged. Incident escalated to executive level. Rebecca's breath caught. Executive level. That wasn't standard. That wasn't even normal. An incident being escalated that high meant someone powerful had stepped in. Someone who didn't want an apology. Someone who didn't care about policy excuses. She looked up sharply. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mouth dry. Slowly, painfully, the truth started to settle in. She hadn't just been rude to an important customer. She had been disrespectful to the wrong family. Rebecca clenched her jaw, suddenly desperate to do something. Anything to undo what was happening. She stood up quickly and walked toward the nearest jump seat phone. She picked up the receiver and asked to be patched through to the lead flight supervisor on the ground. Her voice trembled slightly, but she pushed through it. The response came after a pause. Request denied. You are under observation and temporarily restricted from outbound contact until further notice. She stared at the receiver. That had never happened to her. Ever. Her own airline had cut her off mid-flight. She returned to her seat, legs weak. Her stomach twisted with panic. She had never felt powerless before. Not like this. Not when passengers argued, not when junior staff made mistakes. She was always the one in charge, but now she couldn't even call her supervisor. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, things had gone quiet. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, eyes closed for a moment. Amina scrolled through her tablet calmly. Amir and Layla whispered to each other, sharing earbuds. The atmosphere around them had shifted. Other passengers gave them small nods when they passed by. Their earlier silence replaced with a kind of cautious respect. Chloe came by to offer drinks again. She approached slowly. "Can I get anything for you?" she asked. Jonathan opened his eyes. "No, thank you." Chloe hesitated. "If there's anything you need, just let me know." Amina looked up, offering a small, polite smile. "We're fine now." Chloe nodded, then turned and walked away, casting one glance back at the rear of the plane, where Rebecca sat alone. The plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, but inside, Rebecca could feel the storm was far from over, and it was about to get worse. Rebecca sat stiffly in the crew jump seat at the back of the plane, her hands gripping the edges of the seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mind refused to slow down. She stared straight ahead, her eyes unfocused, her thoughts spiraling in 100 directions. "This can't be happening," she told herself for the 100th time. "It's just water. I didn't yell, I didn't break a rule." But the truth was creeping in, and no matter how many times she pushed it away, it returned stronger. She hadn't just skipped over a passenger. She had judged them, assumed things, treated them like they didn't belong. And now, someone far more powerful than she expected was holding her accountable. She glanced toward the front of the plane, but from where she sat, she couldn't see anything beyond the curtain. She felt shut out, disconnected, like she was no longer part of the crew. Farah moved quietly around the galley behind her, offering no words. She had seen the email too. Everyone had. Once it was sent to the internal system, every crew member on board knew Rebecca had been relieved of duty. No one said it out loud. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. Rebecca grabbed her phone again. She needed someone, anyone, to explain this, to help her. She scrolled through her contacts, pausing on the name of a former supervisor at headquarters. She tapped it, pressed the call button, held the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice. Then a robotic voice. "The number you are trying to reach is currently unavailable." She tried another. Same result. Another. Voicemail. Her chest tightened. She couldn't believe it. People who used to answer her calls in seconds were now ignoring her. She tried a close friend from training school, someone she'd known for years. It connected. She spoke fast. "It's me. Something happened on my flight. I think there's been a misunderstanding and—" But the voice on the other end was cautious, distant. "Rebecca, I don't think I can talk right now." "What? Why?" A long pause. Then quietly, "You're trending on the crew forums." Rebecca's throat went dry. "What are you talking about?" "There's a report, a passenger complaint. Someone said you denied service to the founder's family, the Kings." Rebecca blinked. "The who?" "The King family. Jonathan King. He owns the airline." The world stopped for a second. Rebecca's mouth opened, but no words came out. The voice continued, softer now. "People are saying you refused his daughter water, that you dismissed his wife, that you treated them like they didn't belong in first class." "I didn't know who they were," Rebecca said quickly. "I didn't mean anything. I was just following procedure." "You didn't have to know," her friend replied. "You just had to treat them like everyone else." Rebecca tried to speak, to defend herself, but the line had already gone dead. She sat frozen, staring at the screen. Jonathan King. The Jonathan King. She had heard his name in meetings, seen him in corporate newsletters. Founder and majority owner of the entire airline group. A billionaire businessman who had built the company from the ground up. A man known for keeping a low profile and a long memory. And she had just denied his wife and children something as simple as water. Her mouth felt dry now, her tongue heavy. Her hands shook slightly as she placed the phone down. The pieces were falling into place. The captain's change in behavior. The direct order from the executive office. The blocked calls. The stares from crew members. She had crossed a line without even realizing it. But it wasn't just the water. It was the way she spoke. The tone. The assumption. The quiet disrespect. And now, every mistake was coming back like a wave. Passengers began to move around the cabin again. Some stood to stretch. Some whispered softly to each other. Rebecca caught a few glancing back toward her, their expressions unreadable. She didn't know what they had heard. She didn't know what had been recorded. But she knew how fast stories spread on planes, especially stories with power and scandal. And this wasn't just a story anymore, it was becoming her story. One that was being written without her permission, and one she might never get to rewrite. The hum of the engines was steady, the cabin calm, but Rebecca felt anything but. Her hands trembled in her lap, her eyes darting to the front every few seconds, desperate for a signal, something to tell her this wasn't permanent, that she'd be reinstated, that someone would come over and say it was all a misunderstanding. But no one came, no call from the cockpit, no message from operations, not even a whisper from the crew. She was invisible now. That was what hit hardest. Farah quietly continued prepping coffee service, but her glances toward Rebecca said everything. Unease, caution, and just the smallest hint of sympathy. Not enough to offer comfort, just enough to sting. Rebecca sat still, trying to replay the events from the beginning. Maybe she could explain it all away. Maybe she could say she was distracted, overworked. Maybe she could convince someone that it had nothing to do with bias, or attitude, or ego. But that excuse wore thin even in her own mind. Because when she really thought about it, when she replayed that first moment, Layla asking for water, the polite request from Amina, the calm silence from Jonathan, She knew the truth. She hadn't been following protocol. She had been judging them. They hadn't been loud. They hadn't acted entitled. They hadn't broken a single rule. But something in her, some quiet, ugly instinct, had whispered that they didn't belong in first class, and she had listened to it without a second thought. That was the real reason no one was defending her now. The crew knew. Even Chloe, who had always respected her, hadn't said a word since the captain's announcement. She hadn't even made eye contact since Rebecca had been sent to the back. Rebecca leaned her head against the wall behind her, closing her eyes, but she couldn't block out the low murmur of voices in the cabin. Passengers were talking, she could feel it. That electric silence just before people start whispering the same thing over and over from row to row. The King family, that's them. The girl asked for water and she refused. Did you see how the captain spoke to her? They own the whole airline. She could hear it even if she couldn't make out the words. And then, just loud enough to confirm it all, someone in first class said, "That's the one. She's the one who ignored them." The words hit like glass, shattering in her chest. It wasn't just the crew now. The passengers knew. The Whisper Network had reached full speed, and her name was now attached to a story that would travel further than this flight. People didn't forget moments like this. They shared them, they recorded them. They wrote tweets and posts and screenshots. Her face, her name, her voice, all of it would live beyond this plane. She had been known for running tight cabins, for her sharp presence, for keeping control. She had built her reputation flight after flight, making sure everything stayed in order. But now, none of it mattered. The passengers no longer saw her as the one in charge. She was the one who got pulled from duty, the one who made the mistake, the one being talked about in low voices between seat rows. Her throat tightened as she imagined what would happen after landing. Would someone be waiting for her at the gate? Security? Human resources? Jonathan King himself? The thought of it made her feel cold. She had dealt with angry passengers before. Rude ones, drunk ones, aggressive ones. She had filed incident reports, written warnings, called for air marshals. But this was different. Jonathan hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't threatened her, hadn't demanded an apology. He had just watched. Let her hang herself with her own tone, her own decisions. Then, with one message, he had turned her entire career upside down. She had thought power came from authority, from the uniform, the rules, the control. But the man in 1A had proved otherwise. Real power didn't have to shout. It simply waited. And she had walked right into it, blind. Her hands started to shake again, this time harder. She tried to hide them in her lap, but Farah noticed. "You should drink some water," Farah said quietly, placing a bottle near her elbow without meeting her eyes. Rebecca stared at the bottle. Water. The thing that started everything. She didn't reach for it, she couldn't. It felt like a joke now, like the whole world had flipped upside down over something so small, so ordinary. But she knew it wasn't the water. It was her. And now, she was no longer a respected flight attendant. She was a lesson waiting to land. The flight continued in eerie quietness. From the back of the aircraft, Rebecca watched the movements of passengers as if through a fog. Each time someone stood to stretch or headed to the restroom, she could feel their eyes pass over her. Some lingered just long enough to recognize her face. Others offered polite, distant stares, but it was clear they knew. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was recognition. The tension that had settled into the cabin was unlike anything she had experienced in her entire career. It wasn't loud or disruptive. It was the opposite, controlled, deliberate, and spreading through the plane like a silent alarm no one could ignore. Rebecca sat perfectly still in the jump seat, her back aching from the upright position, her thoughts loud and chaotic. She stared at the floor beneath her, the scuffed metal she had walked over 1,000 times without noticing. Now every inch of the aircraft felt unfamiliar, cold, hostile. The curtain to the first-class cabin opened briefly, and Chloe appeared. She held a tray in one hand, returning from delivering a second round of drinks. She met Rebecca's eyes for just a moment, just long enough for Rebecca to see it. Hesitation, pity. But also something else. Distance. Chloe didn't speak. She turned and disappeared behind the curtain again without a word. That silence was the final blow. Chloe had always respected her, always come to her for advice, trusted her judgment. But now, even Chloe wouldn't stand next to her. Rebecca swallowed the dry lump in her throat and pressed the heel of her palm against her forehead. Her head was pounding, and not from the altitude. Her phone buzzed again, vibrating softly against her leg. She picked it up, hoping, begging for a message from her manager. Maybe someone had called in to pause the escalation. Maybe someone had come to her defense. But it wasn't her manager. It was another email. Subject: Executive Directive, Flight 2087. From Vice President, In-Flight Operations. Details: Ground team instructed to intercept crew member Fields upon arrival. Debrief scheduled immediately. Suspend access badge upon gate arrival. Uniform to be surrendered on site. Incident under executive review. Rebecca read it 3 times before she fully understood what it meant. Intercept. Suspend. Surrender. Her ears began to ring. Her heart beat so hard it felt like it might tear through her chest. They weren't just reviewing her actions. They were preparing to remove her from the airline, permanently. She had heard stories of attendants being let go. Stories passed around between crew during layovers or in break rooms. Most of them involved violence, theft, drunkenness. Never anything like this. Never someone like her. But this wasn't a typical situation. She hadn't just embarrassed herself. She had embarrassed the wrong family. Her eyes lifted toward the front again, her gaze locking on the drawn curtain that hid the first-class cabin from view. She couldn't see Jonathan King, but she didn't need to. His presence was felt through every action that had followed, every silence, every message, every decision that came without explanation. He hadn't lifted his voice once, hadn't asked for an apology. He didn't need to. One message. That was all it had taken. Rebecca suddenly felt small, not in a metaphorical sense. Physically small, like the walls of the aircraft were closing in on her. Like the space that once felt so familiar, so controlled, was now pushing her out, replacing her. She looked down at her uniform, the sharp creases, the embroidered name tag, the neat, polished appearance she had taken so much pride in. It felt fake now, like a costume she wasn't worthy of wearing anymore. She thought back to when she first joined the airline. The excitement, the discipline, the pride. How she used to stand taller when she walked through the terminal, feeling like she was part of something elite. She remembered her first time in first class, how nervous she had been around the passengers. How careful, how respectful. Over time, that nervousness had faded, replaced by experience, confidence. But eventually, that confidence had twisted into something uglier, entitlement. She had started believing she knew who belonged and who didn't, who deserved courtesy and who didn't. And now, the same job she had used to judge others was being stripped from her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a small group of passengers passing by toward the rear lavatory. They didn't speak to her, but they looked. One woman frowned slightly. A man narrowed his eyes just for a second before moving on. Rebecca looked away. The shame was unbearable. She had always believed her seniority, her years of service, her spotless record would protect her. But none of that mattered now. Not against a name like King. Not when her actions had been seen, felt, and most likely recorded by dozens of eyes. And deep down, even if no one had seen it, even if it had never reached the executive office, she knew she had done wrong, not just as a crew member, as a person. And now, the seatbelt sign dinged overhead. A gentle voice from the cockpit spoke through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." Rebecca didn't move. For the first time in her career, she wasn't part of that final round. She wasn't checking trays, securing carts, reminding passengers to stow their bags. She was waiting for the flight to land, waiting for the gate to appear. waiting for her career to end. The soft descent of the aircraft went unnoticed by Rebecca. Her hands remained in her lap, cold and stiff, her mind far removed from the cabin and the gentle movements of the plane as it lowered through the clouds. Every shift in altitude, every slight turn in the sky, felt meaningless now. She wasn't a part of this flight anymore, not in any way that mattered. She sat like a passenger, but not quite. Not with the others, not with the crew. She was somewhere in between, stuck in a purgatory of silence, watching everything fall apart around her, unable to speak, unable to stop it. The seatbelt light blinked on, followed by the final pre-landing announcements. Chloe moved up and down the aisle, checking rows. Farah secured the galley equipment without speaking. Both of them avoided Rebecca's eyes. Even passengers stopped glancing at her now. It was like she had already disappeared, like she was no longer someone who worked here, no longer someone worth noticing. The plane tilted gently, lowering toward the runway. Rebecca tried to slow her breathing, tried to keep her hands from shaking, but she couldn't stop thinking about what was waiting for her just beyond the gate. That email hadn't been vague. She was to be intercepted and her badge suspended on sight. They were going to take her uniform, right there at the airport, like she was a problem being removed, not a person who had once given years to the airline. She imagined it, security standing by as she stepped off the plane, someone from HR, maybe even a representative from King Aviation Holdings. Would Jonathan King be there too? Number he wouldn't need to be. He didn't strike her as the kind of man who chased down punishments. He gave the order once, and it was followed all the way down. The wheels touched down on the runway with a smooth but final thud, followed by a slow deceleration that matched the tension hanging in the cabin. Some passengers clapped politely. Others unbuckled early, eager to get off. But no one said a word to her. Rebecca stared at the exit door near the front of the plane, now clearly visible from where she sat. The boarding bridge was already being attached. The airport's familiar gray walls filled the window, but nothing about them felt familiar anymore. Then the intercom clicked again. The captain's voice returned, this time more formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. The local time is 3:43 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for flying with us." The ding of the seatbelt light switching off sounded like a drum in Rebecca's ears. Passengers rose, bags shifted. People reached overhead for their luggage. The usual small talk began. Where to eat, who to call, what time the next connection was. But for Rebecca, everything slowed. She stood only because she had to. Her legs felt stiff and shaky beneath her. Her throat burned from holding back every emotion screaming to be let out. Farah approached slowly, holding out a sealed envelope. "This just came through," she said quietly, avoiding eye contact. Rebecca took it without a word. Inside was her termination packet, already prepared, already printed, already signed by someone with more power than she'd ever had. A cold, heavy knot settled in her stomach as she glanced at the contents. The language was clear. She was to be escorted off the aircraft. No discussion, no appeal. Her access badge was disabled as of 3:30 p.m., mid-flight. She closed the envelope, feeling as if it weighed more than her entire luggage. Then, like a curtain pulling open on a final act, the main cabin door swung outward. The bridge was in place, and there they were, standing at the end of the tunnel. Two airline executives in suits, a woman holding a tablet, a man in a silver tie. Between them stood a third person in a black uniform. Airport security. Calm, professional, stone-faced. Passengers began moving forward, disembarking one by one. Jonathan King stood from his seat slowly, adjusting the cuff of his jacket, and turned toward the exit with his family. He didn't look back. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. Layla glanced briefly in Rebecca's direction, her expression unreadable. Not angry, not smug, just disappointed. Amina followed with grace, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Then Jonathan stepped off the plane. Rebecca's heart pounded so loudly it was all she could hear. She stood frozen as passengers continued to pass her. Some looked at her, some didn't. But every single one knew exactly who she was now. She had gone from the one giving orders to the one being watched. And the walk down the aisle she had walked so many times with pride, with power, now felt like the longest walk of her life. She wasn't walking toward her next assignment. She was walking toward the end of everything. Rebecca's feet refused to move at first. Her knees felt locked, and her breath came in shallow bursts. The once familiar aisle stretched out before her like a long, narrow tunnel, crowded with passengers retrieving bags, adjusting jackets, waving at crew members. She used to be part of that final wave, smiling, professional, in control. Now she was the only one not moving, not speaking, not seen as crew. She gripped the back of a seat for balance, trying to calm the shaking in her hands. Her name badge still clung to her chest, sharp and metallic, but it no longer held meaning. It was just a decoration now, soon to be taken, along with the uniform that had once made her someone. Finally, the line moved forward enough for her to step into the aisle. She walked slowly, stiffly, careful to keep her posture straight, but her eyes didn't meet anyone's. The voices around her were hushed now, full of restrained energy, the kind people used when something serious was happening and they didn't know if they were supposed to act normal or not. Some passengers looked at her, some didn't. A few whispered behind their hands. No one smiled. As she passed through the first-class section, the silence grew louder. She could feel every set of eyes on her back. The same seats she had confidently commanded hours earlier now felt foreign. The air itself seemed different, heavier, like the atmosphere knew what had happened and refused to forget. Then she reached row 1. Jonathan's family was already gone, but their seats were still untouched. Blankets folded, headrests neat. The only sign they had even been there was a small bottle of water left in Layla's cup holder. Still unopened, still full. Rebecca paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze locking on that bottle like it was some kind of cruel reminder. She moved on. As she neared the exit, the curtain that usually separated her from the outside world felt thinner than ever. She could see the executives waiting just outside the aircraft. No emotion on their faces, no sympathy. The woman with the tablet was already tapping in details, her fingers moving fast. The man beside her held a folder, no doubt containing everything they planned to say. She could only imagine how many termination letters they'd delivered before. But this one wasn't like the others. This one wasn't about theft, or misconduct, or criminal behavior. This was about judgment. She had looked at a family, calm, respectful, kind, and decided they didn't deserve a bottle of water. She had looked at their clothes, their skin, their silence, and decided they weren't first-class material. And now, because of that decision, she was about to lose everything. As she stepped through the door, a stiff breeze from the jet bridge hit her like a slap. She flinched, barely. The man in the silver tie stepped forward. "Miss Fields," he said, "you'll come with us, please." She nodded, saying nothing. What could she say? The hallway echoed with her footsteps as they led her forward. Passengers behind her exited normally, unaware of the tension just seconds ahead of them. But those who had seen, those who had watched her walk that aisle, they would remember, they would talk, and it would spread. She glanced at the airport walls, so familiar yet so harsh now. Every step forward felt like she was walking deeper into something she couldn't escape. They led her toward a side corridor, away from the public gates. She knew this route. It was used for VIPs and security removals. Discreet, quick, quiet, just like her downfall. They entered a small, sterile room with a table, 2 chairs, and a single cabinet. The woman with the tablet handed her a form. "This confirms your immediate removal from duty and access to all flight operations." Rebecca stared at it. "That's it?" she asked, her voice raspier than she expected. The man in the silver tie didn't blink. "This is not a suspension. This is final." She swallowed hard. "I didn't even get a chance to explain." "You were recorded," he said calmly. "Twice. By passengers. By your colleague. And the complaint came directly from King Aviation Holdings." Rebecca's stomach turned. "I didn't mean—" "It's not about what you meant," the woman interrupted. "It's about what you did." Rebecca looked down, her hands trembling. She took a slow breath. Then quietly, she asked, "Do I have to surrender my uniform here?" The woman nodded. "Yes, there's a changing room down the hall. You'll return your badge, wings, and any airline property. You'll be escorted out through a secure exit." Rebecca's world began to spin. Everything she had built, every overnight flight, every holiday she had worked, every extra shift she had picked up, gone. Just like that. She took the uniform bag and walked down the hallway, her eyes stinging. The door to the changing room clicked shut behind her, and for the first time since joining the airline, she cried. Not because she was fired, but because she finally understood why. Inside the small, cold changing room, Rebecca stood in front of a metal bench, her uniform bag clutched in one hand, her fingers stiff. The overhead light flickered slightly, humming above her as she stared at her reflection in the narrow mirror mounted on the wall. Her hair was still neatly pinned back, her shirt still pressed. Her name tag gleamed. She looked like a flight attendant. But the longer she stared, the more she realized. This uniform no longer belonged to her, and maybe it never really did. She sat down heavily on the bench. Her knees felt weak, like they'd been holding back all her weight until now. She let out a shaky breath, trying to control the rising panic in her chest. But the silence in the room swallowed her whole. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned, and before she could stop herself, a quiet sob escaped. It was the kind of sound she'd never let anyone hear before. She had always carried herself with pride. Not arrogance, she used to think. Just confidence. She was precise, professional, respected. But somewhere along the way, that confidence had grown sharp, cold. It had crept into her tone, into her glance, into how she spoke to people she thought didn't belong. And now, here she was, alone, stripped of everything. She took off her name tag first, slowly unclipping the silver plate from her chest and placing it into the bag. Then the blazer, the blouse, her scarf, her ID badge, which no longer opened any doors, her wings, those tiny silver pins she'd been so proud to receive in training. She held them in her hand for a long moment before finally letting them drop into the bag. The metallic clink they made echoed in the empty room like a closing door. She changed into the plain clothes she had stuffed into her carry-on, simple jeans and a t-shirt. No one would recognize her now. No one would know who she used to be. But she felt the weight of that uniform even after taking it off, like it had been stitched into her skin for too long. When she finally stepped out of the room, the woman with the tablet was waiting. She took the uniform bag without a word and checked it off her list. "You're clear to exit," she said. Rebecca nodded silently. 2 security officers joined her without being asked. Not close enough to touch her, not aggressive, but their presence made everything final. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. She followed them down a private hallway that led to a side door near the terminal exit, away from the main crowd, away from the passengers she used to greet and assist. As she walked, memories flashed without warning. Her first solo flight, a surprise upgrade for a young couple on their honeymoon, helping a nervous child calm down mid-air. Being thanked by families, by elderly passengers, by flight captains. The small wins that made the long hours feel worth it. And then, this. She reached the door, and one of the security officers swiped a card to unlock it. The outside air rushed in. No crowd, no press. Just the cold wind and the echo of her own footsteps. She hesitated at the threshold. She looked over her shoulder one last time. Not at the officers, not at the staff, but at the building behind her. The terminal, the gates, the place where she had given years of her life. It looked the same as always, clean, busy, normal. But to her, it would never feel normal again. She stepped outside, the door clicked shut behind her, and just like that she was no longer part of the airline, no longer a senior crew member, no longer in the system. She was just Rebecca Fields, unemployed, forgotten. The phone in her pocket buzzed again. She pulled it out slowly, more from habit than hope. Another message from HR. Your final paycheck and severance details will be sent within 72 hours. Access to internal systems has been revoked. Any attempt to re-enter secure areas will be treated as a violation of company policy. She didn't react. What was left to react to? She walked toward the curb, not even sure where to go. The usual flow of passengers passed by. Families loading into taxis, travelers dragging their suitcases, people rushing into the terminal with boarding passes in hand. It should have been noise. It should have been movement. But for her, it was just a blur. She pulled out her phone again and scrolled through her contacts, names that once meant support. Familiar voices she thought would always answer. She dialed one. Voicemail. She tried another. Disconnected, and another. Sorry, I can't talk right now. Every door was closing behind her. Every connection she thought she had was already turning cold. Not because of what she'd done, but because of who she'd done it to. Jonathan King didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't ask for a scene. He watched. He listened. And then, with one text, he made sure she would never fly again. Rebecca sat down on the edge of a concrete planter outside the terminal, the hard edge digging into her legs. She stared at the parking lot, the lines of cars, the movement of life going on without her. For the first time in her life, she had nowhere to go. No gate to reach. No flight to board. No passengers to serve. She was alone. And worse than alone, she was erased. Rebecca sat on the cold edge of the concrete planter, arms crossed tightly over her chest as the wind picked up and swept through the airport's drop-off zone. The sun was low now, throwing long shadows across the pavement, but she barely noticed. Around her, life continued. Travelers hurried by with purpose. Families reuniting, couples waving goodbye, drivers loading bags into open trunks. A girl nearby laughed as she ran into the arms of someone waiting at the curb. The sound was distant, like it came from behind a thick wall. None of it felt real to Rebecca. Not anymore. She had always thought the airport was hers in some way. Her second home, her battlefield, and her stage. She knew its corridors, its smells, the rhythm of its announcements. It was where she had built her reputation, shaped her identity, earned the respect of her peers. People had known her name. New crew members had looked up to her. Supervisors had trusted her to handle difficult flights. Now she couldn't even go back inside. She reached for her phone again. Not because she had hope left, but because habit still lived in her hands. She opened the crew messaging app, or tried to. Her access was already denied. A message flashed. User not found. Just 2 words, but they cut deep. In the world she had belonged to for so long, she no longer existed. She checked her airline email next, logged out, permanently. She opened her contacts list, scrolled past dozens of names, cabin leaders, scheduling officers, flight coordinators, people she had shared meals with during layovers, people she had covered shifts for, trained, mentored, stood beside in turbulence and emergencies. And yet now, even their names felt like strangers. Her thumb hovered over a contact she had saved years ago. Erica, a former flight partner, now working in a management role. They had shared long overnight flights together, shared gossip, jokes, tears. Erica had once said, "If you're ever in trouble, call me before anyone else." Rebecca tapped the name. The phone rang once, then went straight to voicemail. She ended the call before leaving a message. What would she even say? I didn't mean to disrespect them. I didn't know who they were. It would sound hollow, weak, and false. Because deep down, Rebecca knew it wasn't about who they were. It was about what she had done. The truth was ugly. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't insulted them. She hadn't broken any rules written in ink. But her actions, the cold tone, the dismissive glance, the refusal to offer a basic courtesy, had been louder than any insult. She had looked at that family and decided without hesitation that they didn't belong in first class. Not because they were disruptive, not because they demanded anything, but because of something smaller, quieter, and much more dangerous. a judgment, an assumption. And now, that silent offense had ended her career louder than any scandal she could have imagined. The door to the terminal opened again, and a stream of new passengers poured out, fresh from arrivals. Among them, Rebecca saw Chloe. The younger attendant walked with purpose, wheeling her bag, heading toward the employee's shuttle pickup. Chloe spotted her. Their eyes met for a second. Rebecca's heart leapt just for a moment. Maybe she'd stop. Maybe she'd say something, anything. But Chloe only paused, gave a slight nod, and kept walking. That nod, brief, quiet, distant, felt worse than a slap. It said everything. I saw what you did. I'm not angry, I'm not surprised, but I won't stand next to you anymore. Rebecca looked down at the ground, her vision blurring. She wasn't just out of a job. She was out of a world. The world she had given everything to. Every holiday missed, every overnight shift, every birthday celebrated alone in a hotel room wearing her uniform. Gone. She opened her rideshare app, but stared at the screen for a long time. Where was she even going? Her apartment was across town. Her suitcase was already on the way to lost luggage, standard for terminated employees. HR would ship it if they felt generous. Otherwise, she'd be called to pick it up next week, supervised. She didn't want to go home. She didn't want to be anywhere. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. A new message, from an unknown number. It read, "Sometimes silence says more than anger." JK. Her breath caught in her throat. Jonathan King. Just the initials, but she knew. There was no mistake. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't ignored what happened. He had simply waited, watched, and acted. He didn't shout. He didn't retaliate. He didn't ruin her in public. He let her ruin herself. And now, even after everything, he left her with one final reminder. Why this happened. Not because of power. Not because of revenge. Because people like him, people with real power, didn't need to destroy anyone. They only needed to hold up a mirror. And Rebecca couldn't stand the reflection anymore. Rebecca stared at the message for what felt like an hour. Her thumb hovered over the screen, unmoving, her entire body frozen in place. The words weren't threatening. They weren't cruel. They were simple, measured, like everything else he had done. But somehow, that made them hit even harder. She had been waiting for an attack, something loud, angry, dramatic. But that wasn't how Jonathan King operated. He didn't shout. He didn't humiliate. He just made sure the damage was complete. And now he had sent a message not to hurt her further, but to make sure she understood. Rebecca lowered the phone slowly into her lap, her eyes glazed, the wind tugging at her sleeves. She thought back to the moment it all began, not when the water was refused. Earlier, before that, when the family boarded, when she glanced at them and made her first quiet assumption, that they were out of place, that they didn't match the setting, that they weren't important. That single moment had opened the door to everything else. It had guided her tone, her posture, her coldness. And they had noticed. Of course they had. Not because she had screamed or insulted them or denied them something major, but because people who have faced a lifetime of small dismissals notice everything. The tight smile, the forced politeness, the skipped courtesy, the assumption that they needed to earn their place, and yet they had stayed calm, collected, even when she had tried to make them small. That's what ate at her now more than the job loss, more than the public shame. They hadn't needed to fight her, because they already knew who they were. Jonathan didn't flash his wealth. Amina didn't pull rank. The children didn't complain. They gave her every chance to see past her bias. But she hadn't taken it. And now she was sitting outside the airport, exiled, discarded, forgotten by the very company she once thought she helped run. While that same family, the one she had tried to belittle, likely rode in a chauffeured car, calm and unbothered, heading to a private terminal or a waiting penthouse. Her stomach churned with a hollow, sick feeling. Not jealousy, not anger, but something worse. Recognition. She had built her entire career on the idea that she was fair, that she treated all passengers with professionalism. But now, with everything stripped away, She could see it clearly. She had treated people with respect when she felt they had earned it. She had served kindness, but with conditions. And when someone didn't fit her mental picture of wealth, of importance, of influence, she made them wait, made them feel it. And that had always been wrong. No company policy excused it. No years of service erased it. She blinked hard, fighting back another sting of tears, but they came anyway, quiet, unwanted, steady. She turned her face away from the crowd. No one was watching her now, but shame didn't care about witnesses. It settled in her chest like cement, heavy and cold. Across the street, a limo pulled into the private transport lane. A sleek black vehicle, polished to a mirror-like shine. Two suited drivers stepped out, one opening the back door, the other speaking into a headset. The sight was so smooth, so precise, it barely seemed real. Then the rear door opened. Jonathan stepped out first. Even from this distance, his posture was unmistakable. Shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, the kind of quiet strength that couldn't be taught. Behind him, Amina emerged, her scarf flowing gently with the breeze. She didn't look around. She didn't hesitate. The children followed, composed and silent. Rebecca instinctively shrank back behind the planter, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected to see them again. Not this soon. Not from this close. But none of them looked in her direction. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than any confrontation could ever be. As they walked into a nearby VIP terminal, Rebecca remained frozen, half hidden behind the stone planter. No one would have recognized her in street clothes. No one would know she was the one who had tried to make that family feel lesser. No one would know she had just lost everything because of it. But she would know. And that knowledge was worse than any punishment they could have given her. She stayed there long after the limo had pulled away, long after the terminal doors had closed, long after her phone battery slipped into red. She knew she would have to get up eventually. She'd have to call a cab, find a new place to stay, start over somehow, but not yet. Right now, she was still trying to understand how she had become the kind of person she swore she'd never be. Not cruel, not hateful, just careless, and that carelessness had cost her everything. The sky above the airport deepened into a dull gray as dusk settled in, the kind that made the terminal lights glow faintly against the encroaching evening. Rebecca remained on the concrete edge outside, motionless, watching travelers blur past her in waves of color and sound. Her legs were numb. Her phone battery had long since died, leaving her disconnected from everything. No messages, no calls, no more bad news, just silence. She hadn't moved in over an hour. Her fingers traced the edge of her badge pouch, now empty. Her wings were gone. Her name tag, her uniform, her access. The tools and symbols that had once defined her were now zipped away in a corporate bag, sitting in some anonymous bin inside the HR office. And with them had gone her identity. She had always imagined her exit from aviation would come with a farewell party, a retirement cake, maybe a round of applause from a grateful crew. Instead, it had come like this: a cold hallway, a signature on a form, a message from a man who never raised his voice but changed her entire future with one sentence. Rebecca slowly stood, knees stiff, back sore, bones heavy from the weight of shame. The terminal behind her loomed large, full of lives still in motion, planes taking off, uniforms moving with purpose, schedules being met, smiles exchanged. And her, she no longer belonged to any of it. As she walked toward the curb, dragging her empty carry-on behind her, she passed a young flight attendant, maybe in her early 20s, bright-eyed, wings freshly pinned to her blazer. The girl was laughing into her phone, her voice full of joy and pride. Rebecca didn't stop her, didn't say a word, but she remembered what that used to feel like. The pride, the belonging, the belief that if you worked hard, followed the rules, and carried yourself with strength, you'd be protected. She had followed those rules, but forgotten the most important one. Respect isn't a favor, it's a duty. It's not something you give only to the powerful or the wealthy or the people who look the part. It's something owed to everyone. Every seat, every name, every face. Because the moment you decide someone deserves less, you don't just fail them. You fail yourself. And sometimes, there's no coming back from that. Rebecca reached the far curb where taxis pulled in and out. A driver stepped out, opened the door for her without a word. "Where to?" he asked. She paused. She didn't know. There was no next job lined up, no meeting, no uniform to return to. Just the long road ahead, and the silence inside. "Just drive," she said softly, climbing into the back seat. The door closed. The cab pulled away. Behind her, the airport lights glowed against the sky. But inside her, everything had already gone dark. If this story moved you, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one.